Jack is from Newell, North Carolina. He lived in Newell until his father died at age 5. How many know where Newell is, by the way? At least a few people do. Probably some have never been to Newell. Used to be a railroad town there, and they had a postmaster. I don't think they have that anymore. But anyway, so after his father died at age 5, they moved to Charlotte, into Charlotte, in the Elizabeth neighborhood, where Jack and his brother, Jimmy, or Slug Claiborne, grew up together. Went to Elizabeth School, went to junior high school in that area, and to Central High School. Grew up on 5th Street, basically, and still lives on 5th Street or close to 5th Street.
5th Street.
Okay. He worked for the Charlotte Observer for 40 years. He is a member of the North Carolina Journalism Hall of Fame. He has written several books, and he's going to talk to us tonight about his most recent book. Now that those books are for sale. I think they cost $20, and they are definitely available for sale. After his career at the Charlotte Observer, he worked at UNC Charlotte for Chancellor Jim Woodard as a speechwriter and writing for the university, and then ultimately retired from UNC Charlotte. His papers are at UNC Charlotte. I've not looked at them, but I found that they are there. And so they're in use, good use. What is he going to talk about? He's going to talk about Charlotte in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, and a little bit later. He wrote a column in the Observer, I think called
This Time and Place.
This Time and Place, for 20 years. I remember reading it. Even when I was in law school, I still read the Observer and read his column. In any event, Jack will talk about his book, which is about he and his brother growing up in Charlotte, and as Charlotte evolved and grew with us. When I moved to Charlotte in 1962, my father took a job here. Charlotte was about 250,000 in population. Today, it's slightly under 1 million people. And so I think Jack can educate us on how we got there. I present to you Jack Claiborne.
Thank you, Luther. It's a pleasure to be in front of the Mecklenburg Historical Association again. The last time I was here, you could have counted the crowd on the fingers of both hands. On a rainy night in September and a cold night, it's a pleasure to see so many of you here and hearing the reports of the size of the organization. I would say that the Mecklenburg Historical Association is doing very well, and I congratulate you. I want you to be louder. I want you to do more. I want you to stir up things. Charlotte has I often have people tell me Charlotte has no history. How can that be? We were founded in 1768, before the American Revolution. Cornwallis was here and branded us a hornet's nest of rebellion. We were part of the growth of the gold industry. The mint, the United States Mint had a branch in Charlotte. People think Mint Street is named for the flavor. They don't understand that was where the mint once stood. think the word for Charlotte is that it is a major league city today. It is one of America's newest major league cities, but it does not think of itself as a big city. It thinks of itself still as a small town. And we've got to get over that. And I challenge the Mecklenburg Historical Association to help us reach new heights in appreciation for Charlotte's past. I want to talk about a book a memoir that I did about Charlotte, The Slugger and Me. The Slugger is my brother Slug. How many of you know about Slug's restaurants? Oh yes, good. I sat down to write the book because I felt like Slug's memory, the memory of Slug as a pioneering restaurateur in Charlotte, was being lost. He had died, and people had forgotten the attractions of Slug's Rib, Slug's Choice, and Slug's 30th edition. And I wanted to remind people of that. So I was writing a memoir called The Slugger and Me. Well, Anne-Marie, my delightful wife, read the manuscript and said, "Oh, Jack, there is a third character in this narrative that you've got to account for, and that's Charlotte." Throughout our lives, Slug and I kept encountering incidents when Charlotte was flexing its muscles and getting ready to grow, and so that was essential that I include Charlotte, the Slugger, and me. And so I redid the manuscript several times to account for that, and that's the book. The book has been relatively well received, and I appreciate those of you who have read it and had complimentary assessments to make of it. My father died in January 1937. I was 5 years old. Slugger was 4. We were living on a 93-acre cotton farm in Newell. Newell was then a separate entity from Charlotte. It was 10 miles north of the town. It had its own railroad depot, and our house was a rented farm, and it was located on something known as Jackass Lane. It was a dirt road leading up to Old Concord Road, and at the top of the hill was the home of Squire Newell, who kept jacks in his yard to breed with mares to produce mules, which were a staple of Depression-era farming. And so that was where Jackass Lane got its name. You knew you were getting close to Squire Newell's house because you could hear those jacks honking in his backyard. When my father died, my mother, who had grown up on a farm, asked my older brother Harold, who was 12 and the oldest male in the family, "Harold, do you think you could do the spring plowing?" And Harold, who was ebullient and never thought anything he could do he set his mind to, said, "Yes, I could do that." Well, it wasn't long before there was Harold, skinny, so slight he had to hold the plow handles in his hands this way, and he had to leap every 2 or 3 steps to keep the plow point in the ground to make a furrow. And he was doing the spring plowing, and behind him came my sister Phyllis with a bucket under her arm, dropping seeds in at regular intervals to produce cotton plants. Harold, this is a story in the book about my mother asking Harold if he knew how to handle a shotgun. And Harold said, of course. And Mother said, show me. So Harold reached up over the doorway in her bedroom, got the shotgun down, put shells in it, put it up under his shoulder, pulled the trigger, and blew a hole in the side of the house. But Harold turns out to be one of the heroes in this book, and so does my mother. My mother had an 8th grade education. That was the most that North Carolina offered in her day, and she could have been anything. She was so smart and so industrious and resourceful, but she moved us.
What you talk about where you and your mother and father lived before you went to this difficult house?
Before we lived in the 93-acre cotton farm, which we rented, my family lived in relative comfort. My father and mother created a dairy farm and had milkers and electrified milking machines and a truck. And my sister Phyllis would wear a white overalls and ride the back of the truck. And when they stopped in Charlotte to make milk deliveries, she would run the fresh milk to the door and bring back the empty bottles and make the rounds. One of the places that they stopped was the Alexander home, which was then on East Boulevard. The Depression came. My father built all of those milking machines and barns and that truck on credit, and assuming that the boom would continue. But then October 1929 occurred, and we got firsthand the impact, the human impact of the Great Depression. And my father lost almost all of that and had to retire to a rented cotton farm, and he began felling trees to create more acreage. He still thought cotton prices were going to rise. My mother, after he died, my mother found out that Franklin Roosevelt was coming to town, and she had seen the impact of Franklin Roosevelt in the first 4 years of the 1930s, and she had seen him rescue American agriculture, and she wanted her children to see this great man. In those days, before television, seeing a president was relatively rare, and the only other sitting president that had been in town was Woodrow Wilson in 1916. And so my mother got us all dressed, walked us from our farmhouse up to the railroad depot, about 1.5 miles, and bought tickets on the train, took us into the southern station at West Trade Street and the railroad, which met at grade, and got us onto a trolley car, and we rode the trolley through town and up the hill in Elizabeth and stopped at what was then Fox Street. named for John Fox. Not the football coach. Anyway, we got off the trolley, and just as a rainstorm started, and we had to dash for a shelter, and there was a small grocery at the mouth of 5th Street and Fox Street, and we ducked under the awning there and stood, and other people ducked under the awning, and they told us that if we went farther down 5th Street, there was an alley that would lead us right into the path of the president's motorcade, and we could watch the whole thing there. So that's what we did. We walked down 5th Street to the alley, through the alley, into Park Drive, and stood in an ivy-covered front yard and waited until the president came. And good things did happen to us. On our return walk back from the stadium through the alleyway and into 5th Street, my older sister Alice saw a house for rent and called my mother's attention to it. And my mother, my sister Phyllis, and my sister Alice went up on the porch to survey the inside as best they could through the windows. And they stood there for a while and talked. And finally, Mother said, "Alice, go to the rental agent listed on that sign out there on the sidewalk and rent this place if we can afford it." And Alice did that the very next day. And we moved from Newell into Charlotte in October 1937. My mother felt like she could make a living. She was a wonderful seamstress, and she could do upholstery and slip covers, and she could make curtains, and she could make quilts, and she had 2 errand boys ready at the drop of a needle to run errands for her and get her threads and bobbins and other things that she needed. But their problem was there weren't enough people in the Elizabeth neighborhood who had money enough to pay to have their furniture recovered or upholstered or new curtains or new quilts. And so there was not enough business to keep her going. And after a couple of years, she decided that the thing that she needed to do was cook. She was the oldest of 11 children in growing up, and she had done much of the cooking in the household and had acquired quite a skill for being a good cook. So she moved us from East 5th Street, which no longer exists today, but in those days, 5th Street was a wonderful, bustling, busy neighborhood, lined on both sides of the street in one-story houses, and people who were working class folks. One of them was a police radio man who drove a big black car with an aerial attached to the rear bumper that would swing in the wind as the car drove by. And Slugger and I were always interested in knowing where he was going. Was he going to a murder scene or something? There was a fireman who frequently sat on his front porch in his dress fireman's uniform to advertise his standing in the community. There was a Duke Power lineman who wore boots that had spikes on them for climbing up telephone poles. and Slug and I admired, one, his tan. He was deeply tan, but we also admired those spikes on his boots because we wanted to shinny up telephone poles too. Anyway, it was a busy neighborhood, and it no longer exists today. It's part of the campus of Central Piedmont Community College.
And what else was around you in that neighborhood? You was a hub, your neighborhood.
Yes, it was. The lots of things were around us. The Armory Auditorium, Memorial Stadium, Central High School, Independence Park, Presbyterian Hospital. It was a busy neighborhood, just beginning to flourish as a sort of bedroom community for uptown Charlotte. And we enjoyed living there, but Mother couldn't make it, and so she moved us the next 2 years later into Park Drive, a two-story house on Park Drive that had more rooms, that she could rent rooms, and she could serve meals and make a boarding house. And she found roomers, one of them whom was her youngest brother, who was an orphan, graduated from the junior order home in Tiffin, Ohio, and didn't have a place to go. So Mother took him in, and he got a job, and he paid rent and paid board to live at my mother's place. Anyway, the great thing about Park Drive for Jimmy and me was that it was across the street from the Armory Auditorium. Now, you have to think about this for a second. The Armory Auditorium was the convention center. It was the arena, the Uptown Arena. It was the exhibit hall where if you wanted to sell radios, you could put on an exhibit of radios you could buy. It was a military post. It was a dance floor. Jimmy and I saw the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra come to town on a bus, unload, put their equipment on the stage, and we watched them rehearse. And they had a drummer named Buddy Rich, who was fantastic. Boys 7 and 8, 9 years old, just loved drummers. And they also had a fluffy-haired singer named Sinatra, who is not yet known by the rest of the country, but was on his way to being a star. It was a great place for Jimmy and me because it gave us all kinds of opportunities to make money. We could park cars in the vacant garage and vacant lot next to our house. We could sell programs at events at the Armory. We could sell Coca-Colas and soft drinks at the stadium. We could pick up empty bottles. You got to pick, for every 24 bottle crate you filled, you got a dime, and we could fill 5 crates, and that would be 50 cents. And 50 cents in 1939 and 40 was a big sum of money. If we made $2 parking cars, it would almost buy the groceries for the week. So it was an important opportunity for Jimmy and me to make money.
It sounds like Jack can drive a car, but he doesn't mean that. He's a kid. He's a baby. So you just told them they could park in your car.
Yeah.
He can't drive at this point. He's still a kid.
Well, we would stand in the street and say, "Parking, parking." And people would pay us 25 cents to park in the vacant lot. Next to the armory was the stadium. Of course, the stadium was full of football games, about 60 games a year. It would start out in the early September as a lovely green playing field, and by the middle of October, it was beginning to turn a little tan in the middle, and by November, it was a mud hole. But it gave Slugger and Me opportunities to make money. Once there was a football game, a rare football game, between the freshmen at North Carolina and the freshmen at Duke. Normally, freshmen couldn't play in varsities yet, and that rule hadn't changed. And so it was a big deal to get that game, and was a part of Charlotte's effort to promote itself as an entertainment center. And Slug and I sold peanuts and popcorn at the stadium, and then after the game was over, we picked up bottles and tried to earn 3 or 4 crates full of empty bottles. And in the process of picking up bottles, we found among the trash under the grandstand seats a crumpled up $2 bill. And we never had seen a $2 bill before and didn't know whether it was real or fake. But we waited, and soon as we had turned in our picked up bottles, we rushed home and gave the $2 bill to Mother, who welcomed it as a godsend. And it became known in the family as the night the boys found the $2 bill. That was the human side of the Depression. There were some, in 1940 and 41, war clouds in Europe were gathering, and the U.S. Department of War, we didn't have a Defense Department, it was a War Department, decided that it needed to improve the training of the Army Reserve and the National Guard, so it called for war games in various parts of the country. And in the Carolinas, they were going to have war games, and the goal was to capture Charlotte. And suddenly, every piece of federal land in sight had a pup tent on it. And Slug and I were running among the pup tents, looking to see what was inside, and enjoying the camaraderie of the soldiers, and borrowing their mess kits to stand in line and sample field kitchen food. It was a wonderful opportunity, and invited us to see the military side of life. On Saturday night, after the war games were over, and the soldiers in their starched khakis and their shined shoes would come walking past our house on their way into town to have some fun. And Slug and I were sitting on a rock wall, and I did go into the neighborhood, and people did loan Mother chicken. And that was a part of the whole culture of the Depression. People helped each other and sympathized and empathized with opportunities. My mother was well known in the neighborhood, and her cooking was well known too. So it was an easy chore for me to go and borrow chicken. World War II came, and my brother's colleagues, 18, 19, 20 years old, Harold's generation, began to go into the service. And Harold began pestering Mother to let him go too. He could see becoming an airplane mechanic and building a career out of being an airplane mechanic. And he felt like if he volunteered, he could get his wishes and be assigned to a mechanic school in Florida. And so he kept pestering Mother until he was 19. And Mother finally realizing that the war was going to go on a long time and that she was tired of hearing Harold pester her, so she agreed to let him go, though Harold had been her go-to guy for most of his teenage years. Harold went and was assigned to the 8th Air Force, and then they decided that in addition to airplane mechanics, they needed people who were gunners. So Harold was sent to gunnery school in Texas and came back and was shipped overseas. Even in the military, Harold was supporting the family and holding things together, which makes him one of the heroes of this book. Harold finished his 30 missions. After 30 missions, you got to leave to go home. So after 30 missions, Harold told us he was coming, but he didn't say when. And Slugger and I and my mother were in the kitchen of our house on Elizabeth Avenue and doing the laundry. Anyway, we were doing the laundry, and suddenly in the kitchen walks Harold, drops his flight bag with a thud on the floor, and picks up my mother and just hugs her up off her feet and holds her. And then he puts her down and he looks at Slugger and me and he says to Mother, "What have you been feeding those two? I left, they were boys. Now look at them." Anyway, it was so good to see him healthy, grinning, handsome, wearing an Eisenhower jacket. Do any of you know what an Eisenhower jacket is? It's a tunic that stops at the waist and is tied at the waist or fastened at the waist with a clamp. And it's a very handsome looking garment. And Harold looked splendid in it, and his garrison cap tilted on the back of his head, and that big grin. He was so full of himself. We were so glad to see him. He was there for 8 days, and then he had to go to Chanute Field, Illinois, to train on B-29s so he could go and be a ball turret gunner in bombing the Japanese. Fortunately, the war ended before he finished his training, and Harold came home to be a GI. And my mother was in the middle of a housing crisis. Charlotte had built no houses since 1939, and the people were taking barracks from Morris Field and converting them into apartments to have places to live. And the owner of our house on Elizabeth Avenue wanted Mother to buy it at an exorbitant price or pay a much higher rent. And she didn't have money to do either. But Harold stepped in And using the GI Bill, he found a house right around the corner on Cecil Street that that would house all of us and put Mother out of the boarding house business for good. He wanted to lighten her load, and so he bought the house, and we moved in and lived there happily. Harold got married while we were living there, and my mother died at age 50 while we were living there. After my mother's death, Harold came into the living room where Slug and I were sprawled on the couches, wondering what the fate was going to do for us in the future. And Harold said, "Boys, I want to talk to you alone." So we went into the next room, and he said, "I want you to quit your jobs." I had a job at a restaurant. Slug had a job at the Armory Auditorium. Quit your jobs, concentrate on your studies, graduate from high school. I don't want what happened to me to happen to you. My brother Harold had quit school in the 10th grade in order to take a job. So he didn't want that to happen to us. And he said, "And I want you to go to college if you possibly can." Well, he said he and his wife, Terry, had talked and that we could live with them as long as necessary. What a brother. So that was the way we lived, and that was where we were living when I graduated from Central High in June of 1950. The crowd at the Armory Auditorium was always big for a Central High commencement. And the principal, John Otts, was running through the list of awards being given, and the biggest award was going to be a $250 scholarship to a boy who was going to enter the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for 1 year. You would get $250. And when he got to that award, he called out the name of the winner was Jack Claiborne. And I just about fainted. I had no idea I was in line to get anything like that. And I didn't feel like I deserved it, but I went up and accepted his congratulations and went into a little anteroom off the stage where other award winners were, and I quietly wept. I knew for sure that I was going to go to college, at least for 1 year, at the university in Chapel Hill. I went to the university to get a degree, and I was scared to death most of the time I was there, and struggled to pay my bills. I was a dorm manager, I was a laundry agent, I had a job working in the press box for football games. There were only 8 games a year, but I would earn about $35 a game at working in the press box. I earned $16 a week working for the University News Bureau, and out of that I had to pay my tuition. I had to buy my books. I had to pay for my room and board, and have walking around money. Yeah, it's the greatest thing I covered for the Charlotte Observer.
Kennedy assassination?
May have been the Kennedy assassination. I was not in Dallas. I was working in the bureau of the night newspapers bureau in Washington, and we had just finished our weekly bureau luncheon where we gathered and sort of assessed what we'd done in the week and what we were about to do in the week ahead. And we got back downstairs into our offices, and the little United Press printer that we had in the office that would just alert you to what was going on, and it was going ding, 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 meaning bulletin, 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 bulletin. And it said, shots have been fired on the Kennedy motorcade in Dallas. Early reports said the president had been hit. Secret Service agent Clint Hill said he thought he was dead. That was just one little paragraph. We ripped that off the machine, gave it to the bureau manager who assigned us to go and gather stories. And I went to Capitol Hill to get reaction from various kinds of people, senators and congressmen and their agents, and came back and wrote stories for the wire and our telegraph wire in the bureau. And the manager of the bureau came to me and said, there is a press bus leaving the White House bound for Andrews Air Force Base. Get on it. And I stopped what I was doing, ran out the door and got onto Pennsylvania Avenue and was running past the White House when I saw the press bus pull away. Gone. I missed it. So I went inside the West Wing of the White House, and I found Henry Hall Wilson. Henry Hall was a native of Monroe, North Carolina. I know Henry Hall since he played the oboe in the Charlotte Symphony. He always wore red socks on his tuxedo so you would know who he was and where he was. Anyway, I went to see Henry Hall and I asked him to assess Kennedy's impact on the legislative activities in Washington. And he said, oh, Jack, it's way too early for that. No. And so he began telling me little stories about his early associations with John Kennedy. And then he suggested that we go downstairs and be on the south lawn of the White House and watch as President Johnson arrived at the White House for the first time as President of the United States. So I joined Henry Hall and we went downstairs. The helipad in the south lawn was roped off with gold ropes to keep you out of the rotors of the helicopters. And we were standing there in the dark. Normally the White House, which is usually lit up bright, all the lights were off in memory of the fallen president, and the lights in the office buildings in Washington were off, and the only light available was on the dome of the Capitol, shining through the November trees. And we stood there, and then suddenly on the Virginia horizon was a red light rising like this, like a beating heart, bringing new life to the government. And I watched Johnson's helicopter come, and it came past the Washington Monument, over the Jefferson Memorial, past the cornice of the Lincoln Memorial, and it started its descent. And on the south lawn of the White House, there is a fountain with little fingers of water going up and down. And unaccountably, that fountain was still lighted. Everything else around the White House had been dark, but that fountain was lighted. And as the downdraft from the rotors of that helicopter hit those fingers of water, they curtsied as if assenting to the power passing overhead. And then the helicopter sat down in the helipad, and Johnson got out looking like he had slept in his clothes about 3 days in a row. There were only a handful of people there to greet him, and he went around the gold ropes, shaking hands with each one and saying to them the same thing: pray for me, pray for me, pray for me. It was a dark night in Washington. I wrote that story and sent it to the Observer, and it never got printed. Until years later, on the anniversary of Kennedy's death, I summoned it up again, and we put it in the paper for the first time. Thank you for being such a good audience.